Local elections were just 1 week ago yesterday here in Iowa City. Who won? Who lost? What happened and why? Find out about that tonight with us, with John Deeth and Adam Sullivan. And this would be where we're going to have a really interesting cold opening sequence. But we have all new equipment at PATV, so we don't have it yet, so check back in a few weeks for that. So we will just start the show. It's my great pleasure to welcome back two gentlemen who follow and report on politics as close or closer than anyone else here in Iowa City. I am, of course, talking about Adam B. Sullivan. He's a reporter for the Press Citizen, and John, no middle initial that I'm aware of, Deeth. Do you have one?
C.
C. Okay. Well,
It's for Cougar.
election was a week ago. Surprises. What happened?
Surprises, I would say a big surprise in the Iowa City election is Catherine Champion finishing third. I think a lot of people had her out in front as possibly the leader and almost definitely one of the top two vote getters in that race. And she finished not only third, but she was farther out of second place than Kingsley Botchway, the second place winner, was out of first place. So that was what surprised me
Family
most.
name, backing important folks in the community, including Sally Mason, president of the University of Iowa.
The only donation Sally Mason made actually in this election was to Champion's
I
campaign.
myself was surprised by that. I kind of expected that she would, kind of come in on the name, and also she's worked fairly tirelessly in a lot of things, and that would have that advantage to that. John, what do you think happened there?
Well, I think Catherine had her best shot here with the 21 bar dynamic, with Connie Champion trying to hand off the seat, and I don't think she gets a second chance. I think Rockne Cole, even though he finished further back, has got a better shot at running a future campaign. In fact, he's already talking about running again in 2015.
Oh, he's committed to it. He's told people online anyway, save your signs. We're going to do it again. Is that too soon to announce something like that? That far out?
I mean, if some Joe out of the blue came and said he was running for city council election in 2 years, that would be way too early and everyone would dismiss him. But if you had already been a candidate, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying you're going to go ahead and run
And
again.
it was fourth, but it was a respectable fourth.
Yeah.
He wasn't way out of the money.
I spoke to him over the weekend, and he said, Yale, if I had got 500 votes, I might not run again. I certainly would announce right away. But he got, what did he get, 3,618 votes, which is I looked at the numbers here. I broke them down from the Johnson County's auditor's office, and some of the candidates who lost still received more votes than winning. For instance, Susan Mims, when she ran, 2 election cycles ago in 2009. Are there more people voting, or do you think there's more people voting there's something special about these candidates this time, win or lose, that brought people perhaps out of the woodwork?
Well, I think Kingsley Botchway brought a bigger personal constituency to the table than Rockne Cole did. Not that Rockne Cole didn't bring people in, but there was already a lot of overlap between his support and the traditional progressive coalition. And it was the 21 bar issue that was really driving turnout. Something like 20% or so of the vote simply went uncast. People were showing up to vote on the bar issue, but didn't vote on the council candidates. And not just in the student precincts either. In some of the places like Windsor Ridge and Manville Heights, people were about 10% of the voters were just skipping the council races.
And exclusively voting on the bar issue.
And exclusively voting on the bar issue, which over 99% of the voters voted on the bar issue. That's like president level.
Adam, let me ask you, you've covered this fairly closely for some time now, a number of papers here in Iowa City. This is the first time, to my recollection anyway, that I've seen a consortium, a coalition. I saw a lot of social media support. Hey, make sure you vote for Cole and Porter and Kingsley. I've never seen that before.
Right.
What do you think informed that? I've heard that it was kind of Karen Cubby, former council person, who anointed this or suggested that. Do you think that was effective? Do you think that hurt?
Certainly in all races, there are kind of those informal coalitions where even in this race, you could make the case that Champion, Dickens, and Mims were somewhat of maybe the establishment or the business coalition, some people might say. But with this progressive coalition, Botchway, Cole, and Porter, it was very explicit. They all seemed to be on board. Cole seemed to be pushing it a little bit more than the other two candidates, but I'd say that was definitely unique that they were very explicit about the fact that they were kind of running as a coalition. And I covered 4 of the candidate forums, and twice during those forums, you don't get a lot of time on the mic, but twice during those forums, Cole made a point of endorsing both Porter and Botchway. And
Was
Botchway
that
is his direct, not in those forums, but I think they had endorsed each other, all 3. Is that right?
It was, the way Karen put it at the joint event was, they're not asleep, but I'm slating them. And yet at the same time, Kingsley ran about 900 votes ahead of Rockne Cole, and again, I think that's just he brought a personal constituency to the table, just people who knew him from his other activities in the community that Rockne Cole didn't as much.
And also, Cole and Botchway could both be considered outsider candidates to some extent. They hadn't run for political office before, but what Botchway had that Cole didn't was quite a bit of backing within government. He's a colleague of John Deeth's over at the county. He had quite a few contributors from the county, and obviously a lot of support from pretty seasoned government and political
And moving ahead to the council term, that opens a channel of communication between Iowa City government and Johnson County government that hadn't always been there before. I'm just going to editorialize a little bit. This candidacy would not have happened if Tom Slockett were still auditor instead of Travis Weipert.
He would have prevented
Yes.
an underling from running for office?
Yes, he did it before.
Really?
So.
How much of it, and I don't want to sound like Joe Biden here, I was very impressed with Kingsley. I only met him the first time, I think, at one of the forums, and then he did join us with the other non-incumbent candidates. But, I spoke to people around town, and it's kind of like, well, that he's clean, he's bright, he's articulate, those kind of Joe Biden things. And that was a big issue from a number of the candidates, this race, was race itself or diversity. How much of that was that appeal to the electorate that, hey, here's this black guy, but not too black? I mean, in those kind of terms that might make white people in flyover country uncomfortable.
I think you can see it in the numbers that people weren't voting for Botchway just as a diversity vote because I think most people have seen all the candidates would say Botchway was a better prepared candidate than Royce Ann Porter was, and it showed in the numbers. And so if someone was just wanted to vote for a black person, then Royce Ann Porter would have done a lot better than Kingsley, or would have done as well as Kingsley had done.
And there were only a couple places where she did. I'm thinking particularly of the Twain neighborhood that she worked very, very hard. The undervote was low there, and that was one of the few precincts that Royce Ann won.
When they had these candidate forums and all that stuff, and I went to the one, those were kind of, fairly structured, this and that. Were those even decent opportunities for people to get informed about candidates? Because they were all asked the same question. Oftentimes I heard, when I asked them when they were on my show, some of the forums even featured the same questions. It doesn't seem like an opportunity for people to really be seen being fluid, making decisions, coming up with answers right at the same time, so much as like, hey, this is tonight's performance. What's the efficacy of candidate forums?
How many were there?
There are 5 of them,
Five.
which is, usually there's about 3. This year there are 5, so that's a little bit many, and there definitely was some overlap between forums, but I think the biggest thing those do is, first of all, you're seeing the candidate speak and address some issues, but also, they make themselves very available before and afterwards. So if you want one-on-one time with a candidate, there was definitely ample opportunity to do that.
It was interesting that Terry Dickens deliberately skipped a couple of them. I'm editorializing, saying deliberately, but the more progressive forums were the ones that Dickens didn't go to.
Progressive.
So Dickens didn't attend the forum sponsored by a handful of environmental organizations and then by the bicycling groups. So he did have scheduling conflicts that he said about, so I don't know. I'm not inside his head. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe he actually had legitimate scheduling concerns, but
It seemed like a statement.
No, and I absolutely
Yeah.
would have loved to have Mr. Dickens and Mims on the show, but because of my own time constraints, I wanted to give a voice to the people nobody knew. They have to stand on their records. I was looking at the numbers. When was the last time in Iowa City that someone was voted out, when someone lost? As I've been following the city council since I lived here, Regina Bailey has left, Wilburn has left, Mike Wright has left, Amy Correa has left. The other council member is an older fellow I bumped cigarettes to a couple times when I'd go rake the muck. What was his name?
Wright?
No, it was an older gentleman.
Irfan?
Might have been. Point being, I don't remember any of these people losing an election. When was the last time that happened?
Vanderhoff in 07.
07. So
Yeah.
the incumbency is pretty strong. Who did she lose to?
She lost to Hayek and Wright.
that was a 21 election as well.
Yes.
You had said that there was a fairly significant number of people coming out just to vote on that issue, leaving alone, and I might expect that from student precincts, but certainly not Manville Heights, an older established neighborhood, the other places. What do you think informed people that they cared enough about that issue, but not care enough about to vote for who's going to be the ostensible leaders of their city?
It's so much more difficult to make a decision on the candidates to run for, especially in a race where there are differences between candidates, but not really stark differences like you see on the national level. And so it really is, it's a challenge for an average voter to figure out what the candidates are all about. Whereas with the 21 ordinance, we've been debating it for years and years. People have their minds made up. They don't need to do a lot of research on that. So it's an easier vote to make.
This is the third time the 21's been on the ballot?
Yeah, third.
And they've won twice. They lost
The first one,
Yeah,
07.
it seems to me, and this could just be my own, neuroses, but they always have their issue party, their campaign party, out at Bob's Your Uncle, which is about as far geographically as you can get within Iowa City city limits from downtown. The area that they're really, is that bad PR to have this event that, hey, we want to protect this neighborhood, but we don't care enough about this neighborhood to even have our event someplace downtown? What's going on with Bob's Your Uncle? How did that become the place for these folks?
The ownership, I think.
Really?
Yeah, Randy Larson owns it. He's a nice guy. I don't know if he's involved with Democrat politics, but I know Democrats.
He's hosted a fair number. I know he's hosted Jack Hatch, Janelle Reddick, a few other events as well.
Okay, it just seemed
They've
kind
got
of
good pizza.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I've heard that from a number of folks. It just seemed odd, like we're going to
Best
go
pizza is
all the
Polly Eye's
way
Republican pizza.
over here. Well, what was one of the jokes at the roast? They're so environmentally conscious, they're not even going to offer delivery because they don't want to pollute. But that's something, John, that you tirelessly advocated about. You caught some flack for it. Why do you think that? I mean, you very articulately expressed why you thought that was an issue on the larger scale, and 18 is adult and all that, which we can talk about. But my question is, what is so freaking unique about Iowa City that in any place else in the country, any other college town, no one's having this discussion? It never rose to the level of being a human rights issue. Is alcoholism and alcohol so just indelibly, ingrained in the culture and the life of Iowa City that we can't imagine life without 20-somethings or 18-somethings getting drunk?
And it has no direct bearing on my life. I'm pushing 50 and I've been sober for almost 30 years. It's just there's a huge contradiction in the law between the voting age and the age of majority for most things and the drinking age. And it's kind of an orphaned issue because the 18 to 21-year-old group is not plugged into politics yet, and by the time they're already over 21, and overwhelmingly there's a I got mine attitude. I think it was a mistake on the part of the people who pursued this to try it again. It felt settled in 2010. I think the biggest loser this election is George Whitcraft from the Union Bar, because I somehow think that he's going to be randomly checked a little bit more than the averages would say.
Capriciously.
Yeah, that's happened before. It happened to Leah Cohen and why is Bo James? She backed away from the issue.
And I'm not even in disagreement with you that that's a discussion that's certainly worth having. What is the age of majority?
Yeah.
What rights and privileges are entitled to that, and why
And
aren't
nobody
others?
wanted to have that conversation
But
except
why
me.
do you think Iowa City locally is the good place for that to be a forefront issue?
I felt like these three bar elections have given us a unique and rare opportunity. I guess not unique since we've done it 3 times, but a rare opportunity to talk about this in a political context. And the 21 Makes Sense, it pains me to even say that, the 21 Makes Sense coalition ruled it off the table. The proponents of 19 didn't pursue it as an issue. It's simply something nobody wants to talk about except me.
I think there's a pretty stark shift between the 2010 debate and the debate this year, whereas in 2010, it was about the practical parts of the ordinance, about what the ordinance actually does to these handful of metrics that we look at, but it was also in large part about the ethical or the rights issue, that 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds are adults and they ought to be able to get into bars, is the point that a lot of people made. Whereas I think this year, that conversation was pretty much mute, and it was pretty much just about the numbers, saying, here's what it was like before the 21 ordinance, here's what it's like now, and that rights conversation really wasn't a part of it.
Yeah, it did what they wanted
Well,
it to do.
both sides, and this is the beauty of numbers, is that you can use the same numbers to prove 2 different points, but both sides kind of said, hey, it's safer and this and that, and other folks said, hey, it's really not safer. Adam, you and your paper, a number of other your colleagues, they follow this. What do you think? Is there a finite, like this absolutely downtown is safer, is cleaner, more orderly, less sexual assaults, those kind of things? Or is that still up for debate?
You can look at different metrics and pull out different things, but I think in general the numbers are on the 21 proponent side. If you say you want an ordinance that cuts down on these handful of things that the 21 ordinances cut down on, then you'll vote in favor of the 21 ordinance. And I would say that the anti-21 folks, they did make some good points, but they did play a little bit loose with the facts a few times too, and so I think that discredited them to some extent.
They also made absolutely zero outreach outside of the student community, to the point of repeatedly no commenting in the press, and there was no upside for them. They simply had a strategy of, we're not going to target the larger community, we're simply going to target students, But it did give the 21 side another thing to hammer with. These people, nobody supports us but the bar owners and John Deeth, and they're not even answering questions. There was even a serious discussion within the 19 campaign about whether to participate in a forum.
Well, you know, when it happened, it was 2 years ago, for the last time I was on the ballot. Is that correct?
3 years ago.
3 years ago. And
Yeah.
then now, there might still have been some loose tendrils of people on this election who kind of remembered what it was like, this and that. If it cocomes up again, it would be, they could do it in 2 years?
As a practical matter, it's probably 3 with the petitioning process.
Sure, sure.
So it'll probably be on the presidential
being,
election ballot.
Generationally,
Yeah.
there might not be anyone who remembers it. We might have had a full slate of
Yeah.
University of Iowa students who've always known it to be 21 only.
We're getting to that
Do
point.
you think then they bring it up again? And if they do bring it up again, just speculatively, what do you think the results will
Oh,
be?
I hope they don't bring it up again. I think this issue is dead and buried, and I think it's simply a matter of the handful of bars that really, really want to push this, adapting to the new environment downtown. I think there's a grand plan at the high levels of the university to
Attract a better class of drunks?
Well, not yes, but no.
Classier
To
class.
scare away little brother Flounder, so to speak, and those folks are being replaced by international students who don't cause as much trouble downtown,
Well,
as much visible trouble.
I spent a tiny bit of time in Ames a year ago for Maximum Ames, and there it's a little different because there's kind of the old historic Main Street area, which is like the grown-up kind of bars and area, and then there's college, campus town. But even in campus town, and people have said to me, and I've kind of raised the issue, like, is it really, oh no, it's like this, all colleges are like this, and I always found that kind of hard to believe, and I didn't see, you know, on a Friday or Saturday night there, the level of, whoa, that you'd see here on a Tuesday, and could that be a function of that's, you know, I think Iowa State's 85% in-state students, people from Iowa, maybe the first generation going to college, maybe this, maybe that, versus here, University of Iowa, half or just over half out-of-state students, maybe a different, you know, social background, kind of entitled kids, Chicago suburbs. Does the kind of students having access to alcohol make a difference, or is it just the age thing?
Certainly, you know, there's so many moving parts and so many factors to this that it's impossible to pinpoint one, but certainly what you're talking about is one factor that goes into it. But when you talk about why this is an issue in Iowa City and why this keeps coming up in Iowa City, I think the most important factor is that we have a city code that's has a few aspects that are very grassroots oriented. It's much easier in Iowa City to bring about a referendum
The
like
home
that
rule,
than it is
yeah.
in Ames or Coralville or wherever else.
When they had it on this election, you know, as John mentioned, you know, about a change in the dynamic of downtown. I was concerned when it was 3 years ago, as some folks might, it might put a damper on business. There might be empty storefronts. I hate to use the word vibrant, which our council loves, but it seems like other businesses have moved in, non-alcohol related businesses. And to their credit, the city's then come back and looked at it and said, well, hey, these places didn't have a problem. We can extend their hours because they either have food or, of great interest to me, you know, live music and performance, comedy, stuff like that. So I don't see there being this quite as hyper limited as the pro-19 folks said.
Interesting to me that a lot of the heaviest opposition seemed to come from 80-somethings in senior housing areas who probably rarely set foot downtown, and certainly not after 10 on a Friday or Saturday night. And there is a dynamic, and I've been bashing on it for years, of what I call love the Hawkeyes, hate the students. And I think part of this, I mean, part of it certainly is about misbehavior downtown, but part of it is also about keeping the students in their place, so to speak, so they don't. I know in the 80s we had a rent control ballot initiative, and that starts to really hit people in the pocketbooks.
All right, last question on this issue, because I do believe it has been talked and written to death by all three of us here. When the day after the election, you had a piece in the Press Citizen, like, well, it didn't pass, this and that. Did you just have that in the chamber, like ready to go, or did you know in advance somehow that the election was going to go this way? Because it was the morning after the election, you had that didn't pass. How'd you swing that?
I knew this thing was going to lose and lose big 2 hours into the first satellite site when the numbers weren't happening. The student turnout was roughly, the early vote student turnout was roughly half of what it was in 2007. 10's harder to compare because it's a general election year. And I also think that the student percentages weren't as high as the 90-ish% that they were getting in 2007 and 2010. It was probably down into the upper 70s somewhere. Particularly young women were not happy with the party scene the way it had been. You notice Catherine Valdi, student government president, endorsing the 21 side.
Let's talk for a moment about the turnout itself, which a lot of folks were very pleased. It was 22.4%, total of 10,935 voters. I still think that's abysmal. I've raised that. Any election show I've had, I said, what's going on? Where is this? But I was looking back, 2013, this year's 22.4, the last council election, 13.6, and the one before that, just under 10%. So we've seen a steady increase, almost a doubling over the last 4 years, even though the amount of registered voters has dropped by 3,000 since last time. I don't know, did 3,000 people die? What's that about?
There's a purge process that goes on after presidential elections. 2009 was a record low election. You had Dickens and Mims against two student candidates who've both left town now. It was a walkover, basically. What would be really interesting to me is if a student candidate and the 21 bar issue were on the ballot at the same time, which has never happened. They've always been on opposite cycles.
What do you think Adam speaks to, and again, 22 is better than 13, so I'm glad more people participate. Still feel like it's pretty low. What do you think in a town like Iowa City where everyone has an opinion, everyone's willing to share it, everyone's involved, and we think very highly of ourselves, and yet less than a quarter of the people go vote? What's going on?
Good high turnout is good, but the other side of that is if you're not going to take the time to get informed, and in a local election, like I said, it's a challenge to get informed, then you shouldn't vote. Then you should stay home, and if you're not going to be an informed voter and make a wise decision. The other thing I would say is that we put a lot of attention on who turns up to vote, but I would argue that democracy is way more important after Election Day. It's more important to show up at the meetings, to make your voice heard, and so even if you didn't vote in this election, or even if you did, find the issues you care about and track those issues at the council, write letters, show up to meetings, and do those kind of things between elections that really, I think, can be a lot more impactful than your single vote on Election Day.
Okay, I have a few more questions just about the Iowa City election, then I want to talk about Coralville for a minute. Looking at the numbers, Susan Mims, who won this time, in her last election, she had 75% of the vote, which she had 3,532 votes. This time, she actually had more votes. She had 4616 votes, but she only got 42% of the election, almost half the percentages. Do you think that this was a closer race than she had anticipated? I mean, she did fairly well. She had, incumbency helps. But what do you think attributed for her not being the overwhelming force that she was 4 years ago?
Stronger opposition.
Across the board, Adam?
I think that's right. I think I would say Susan Mims did not seem like the front runner for most of the election, or maybe any of the election. I think most people who watch the race closely might say that as well. But I talked to her on election night, and she made a really good case of why she won, and that's because she's a lot more experienced, and she probably knows the issues quite a bit better than any of the other candidates in her race.
Okay. Coralville, which I guess is a real town now because it's getting attention and they're building, and I don't want to disrespect Coralville, but it got a lot of attention nationally. In fact, the New York Times,
Al Jazeera, in fact, was here on election night.
Wow, that's fantastic. The Koch brothers, billionaire, they finance a lot of stuff, PACs and that kind of stuff. One of their subsidiary things, Americans for Prosperity, was very active in the Coralville race. Who did they support, and what was their interest in the race in Coralville?
Well, they actually couldn't and didn't support any candidates, but they put out materials criticizing the three incumbents who were running. And so while they didn't officially have a side, there was a slate of candidates who were said to be associated with them. But
Adam and Winkler and Petzel.
Do we know how much they spent?
They won't say, but they said they wouldn't be outspent, and it honestly wouldn't have taken a lot to they wouldn't have to spend a lot to have outspent
because
all
the
the
total
campaigns.
the total number of voters for all of Coralville was it was like less than 3,000 voters for
That's
all
right.
of Coralville.
But that's
so if
still
they
a
spent,
record.
Really,
Yeah.
still a record.
Right.
When they did it, I guess they got into a kerfuffle with the folks at KCJJ. There was some
Sure did.
some talk about the appropriateness of their contract. They don't pay rent. They provide advertising, which I think is fair. People will do that stuff. That's a whole other conversation. What I found interesting, though, apparently there was maybe some personal attacks levied against some of the folks at KCJJ. Phone numbers out, phone calls come in, that kind of stuff, which clearly is unfortunate and not appropriate. But is it just my imagination? I mean, I haven't listened to KCJJ in a while, but isn't that kind of their bread and butter of calling people on the line? Let's call so and so. Their number is this right now,
Right.
and doing that thing. And so was it a goose gander thing? Because that story became a story in and of itself.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's nothing new going on there. That stuff just was getting more attention. But I would say that Whether or not their agreement with the city is fair is up to discretion, but I would say, though, that it is unique, that I don't know of any other news organization that has a deal like that with its municipality. That deal is definitely unique.
News organization versus if they were just
A media organization,
media
whether it's
organization.
whatever it is, yeah.
So that could be something that could
PATV
be.
has something like that, but that's the closest I can think of.
Yeah, well, nobody here is making 3 nickels. So,
Exactly.
but what it was, and people were very, I won't say antagonistic, but people wrote letters. Don't let them influence it. We don't want outside money and these rich Republicans trying to do this. And that's a whole nother conversation to have, and they might have fair points. But isn't that what George Soros has been doing for years? I mean, why is it like, we don't want Republicans giving money to influence elections, but it's fine when Democrats do it?
It's interesting because the slate that wound up winning, which is John Lundell for mayor, Gill and Hof reelected, and Lori Goodrich, who was a longtime city employee. I think Americans for Prosperity completely misread Coralville. They thought it was West Des Moines or Ankeny or someplace that sprung
More
out of no
traditionally
place.
conservative place.
Yeah, and there were a couple of other things going on. It was which Republican was getting the tax break, and it was some involvement from Doug Gross, who we know from a lot of ties to Branstad and running for governor. But they misread Coralville Pride. Another thing I think that was going on here is AFP was trying to establish a beachhead in Johnson County. There was statewide interest in the supervisor election, which the Democrats lost and the Republicans won. And I think the thinking was if they can get Johnson County to eventually be a 55% Democratic county in a general election instead of 65, then it makes a whole lot harder for a Democrat to win the state.
Adam, what do you think? You covered this quite extensively.
I didn't cover Coralville a whole lot, but I observed it. The only thing I would add is that if you look at the election results, the candidates that Americans for Prosperity targeted and tried to get to lose, they won. And so you can say that's a loss for Americans for Prosperity. However, they wanted to make an issue out of the debt. They wanted to make Coralville's, it's technically $280 million in debt, which is more debt per person than any other municipality in the state. They wanted to make that the issue, and they absolutely did make that an issue. And I think the council, when they take their seats at the end of the year, they absolutely have a charge to try to do something, or at least aesthetically, to make it look like that debt's not so bad. And so in that regard, and that wouldn't have happened if Americans for Prosperity hadn't been involved in the race. And so from an issues perspective, while they lost from a candidate's perspective totally, they were blown out of the water.
Awareness.
By an issues perspective, I think there might have been some wins in there.
And there might have been more receptivity to the issues, except for the way the campaign was conducted. And there was a backlash. It was Coralville Pride is what carried the day.
Right, and the anti-Koch brothers folks did a good job of getting out ahead of it. The Koch brothers absolutely, I don't think, had any decision-making power of we're going to target this Coralville race. I think they don't have much to do with what's going on in the ground in their organization, but. The Democrats and the establishment in Coralville did a really good job of getting out ahead of it, saying this is Koch brothers money, we don't want this outside money, and so that's a credit to their organization.
Watching the early vote come in, there was in the supervisor election, you could clearly see there was a spike in Republican early voting, and that didn't happen in Coralville, so everything seemed on track for a victory by the establishment candidates, which were a Democrat, a Republican, and an independent.
Got about 2 minutes left. I want to bring it back to Kingsley Botchway, who did win here in Iowa City. And his issue, or not his one issue, but one of his issues, and one of the issues that was fairly predominant in this campaign was diversity, diversity, diversity. Well, as you know, you're both fairly good friends of mine. I spent the last 5 months in Chicago, where I grew up, in Edgewater, Rogers Park, the single most diverse neighborhood in the United States by census data. I go get a haircut, it's an Italian guy. Here comes my mail, it's a black guy. Here I go get my car fixed, it's Irish. That's diversity. When people talk about diversity in Iowa City, they're really just talking about black folks and white folks not getting along. You're both white folks. What's the problem? What's going on?
There's a lot of problems. That's a tricky subject. But one thing that I think is very positive is right now there's one person of color in elected office in Johnson County, and that's Tuette DeRue. She's a school board member. Next year, when the new council members take their seats, there will be 4 people of color. An African immigrant, a Latino woman, won council seats in University Heights, and then Kingsley Botchway.
And that sounds fairly diverse to me. That's not just the black versus white or white versus, which is kind of how it gets talked about, at least around the water cooler or the laundry line, those things. John, what do you think?
I think it's going to change the discussion within the city council, having Kingsley, a young person, an African American at the table, and I think it may. There's going to have to be at least some discussion of a more serious type of the driving while black kinds of issues that people are faced with.
it's worth noting Susan Mims is married to a black man. She has biracial children, and she's voiced some kind of interest in these kinds of issues too.
Sure, I'm not saying it's exclusive purview of people of color themselves, but it was part of the race this year. Was, hey, you want some diversity? Here's some you can vote for right now. What though, talking about what he's going to do, and when I had the incumbents on, and they were all kind of this, it's fairly typical political platitudes. Well, we're going to listen and we're going to respond. And I says, everyone who's ever been elected has said that, and yet we're still kind of all steamed at them half the time. How are you different? What do you think is going to happen with him? Because he was fairly well supported by Regina Bailey, who's kind of become a establishment. She helps kind of craft folks around town, but also, through her, I guess, the support of Moen. So this is like, here's this guy who's, I'm this outsider and this and that, but wait, if you look at who's kind of giving him some support, it is the more traditional moneyed base with those interests. What do you think? Do you think once he's on council, he's going to lose his identity, or he'll be his own man?
I don't know. I don't think he'll lose his identity. There's a very steep learning curve anytime you get into elected office, and so the first year you're on council, you're really not doing much. You're just trying to catch up with what's going on here.
Okay.
And you get thrown straight into budget season.
Yeah.
But he works in county government. He's obviously close with a handful of pretty active people, and so I think he'll be surrounded by the right people, and that goes for all the city council members.
Wish him all the best, and as I told him when on the show, thanks, congrats to those who won, and thanks to everybody who ran, because we need that kind of involvement, and I appreciate the involvement of you two gentlemen covering politics as well as you do here in Iowa City. It's a great pleasure to have you on. We'll have you on again in 2 years for that next election postmortem.
Thanks
everybody at home for watching,
Thanks.
and we will see you next week. Thank you, gentlemen.
That was good.
And we'll film a stinger.